Lorraine Dupree was 40 years old the afternoon a woman she had never met stood in the parking lot of a restaurant and announced that she was carrying Lorraine's husband's child, and then laughed at the expression she expected to find on Lorraine's face. She did not find it. Lorraine looked the way she always looked, composed, unhurried, dressed in the practical clothes of a woman who had somewhere else to be and had stopped here only briefly. She drove a 7-year-old sedan. She wore a watch her grandfather had given her and carried a bag that had scuff marks along the bottom edge from years of being set on floors and concrete and the beds of work trucks. To look at her, you would have found nothing remarkable. The woman's name was Priya Sorrell. She was 31, polished in the specific way of someone who had rehearsed this moment more than once, and she had arranged the encounter with the confidence of a person who believed she held every card in the room. She had the look of a woman who had been told that the wife was timid. What Marcus Dupree had never thought to tell her, what he had never once thought to ask himself in 11 years of marriage, was who his wife had been before he met her, and what she had spent the last 4 years building in the hours between when he fell asleep and when the alarm went off. Priya Sorrell stepped forward with one more thing to say, and then her heel caught the parking lot curb, and she went down by her own weight and her own momentum, and Lorraine stood where she had been standing, still, level, untouched, and looked at her on the ground with the expression of a woman who had already made her calculation and had nothing left to prove. The lawsuit was filed 9 days later. It was not the one Priya Sorrell expected. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from, and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The house on Renwick Street in Virginia Beach sat 3 blocks from the water, close enough that on still mornings the air carried salt through the kitchen windows, which Lorraine had replaced herself 2 summers ago. New sills, new weather stripping, new casings she had primed and painted a clean white that still held its color without yellowing. She had done the work on a long weekend when Marcus was traveling. And she had done it because the originals had been leaking cold air since the first winter they lived there, and she had decided finally that waiting for someone else to fix a problem she had the skill to address was not a philosophy she could sustain. She was an architect. She had been licensed for 12 years and had run her own practice for the last 4. A firm of 5 people that she had grown from a single commission, a garage conversion on a corner lot in Norfolk, into a steady portfolio of residential and small commercial work along the Tidewater coast. The firm's name was on the glass door of a rented office suite on Virginia Beach Boulevard in letters she had applied herself on a Tuesday morning 4 years ago, and she had stood back and looked at them for exactly 1 minute before going inside to work. Her grandfather had been a building contractor in Richmond for 38 years, and he had taken her to job sites before she was old enough to read blueprints, and had taught her to read them anyway, marking her copy with a red pencil whenever she got the scale wrong until she stopped getting it wrong. She had been 8 years old. She had never forgotten the feeling of the pencil marks, and had made a private decision at that age that she would not require them indefinitely. By the time she was 12, she was reading floor plans correctly on the first pass, and her grandfather had retired the red pencil and kept it in his shirt pocket like a credential. He presented it to her the day she received her architecture license, at a ceremony he had driven 4 hours to attend. Ernest Dupree, no relation to Marcus. The shared name had seemed like a coincidence at the time, and struck her now as something she should have examined more carefully. Had died 5 years ago at 77, leaving her his drafting table and a set of blueprints for a house he had designed in 1982 and never built, and a phrase he had repeated to her so many times over her lifetime that she heard it now in his voice without trying. The ones who don't see you coming are the most expensive mistake you can make. He had meant it as a caution to stay humble in the presence of capable competitors. She understood now it worked in both directions, and that the person in her life most overdue for its lesson had been sleeping in her house for 11 years, without once asking the right question. Only 2 people outside her immediate professional circle knew the full scope of what Lorraine's firm had accumulated in 4 years of operation. Her business attorney, a woman named Patricia Essay, who had structured the firm entity and managed its contracts with the precision that a practice built on precision required. Lorraine had not mentioned the firm's current valuation to Marcus. She had not mentioned it because he had stopped asking about her work in year 2 of the practice, around the time his own career had become the organizing principle of their household conversations, and she had found that silence easier to carry than to explain. It was one of the small costs she had not noticed accumulating until she sat down one evening and added them all together, and the total was larger than she had expected it to be. Marcus was a regional sales director for a medical equipment company. He was good at his work in the way that certain people were good at the performance of a role, convincing in the room, less disciplined outside it. He traveled frequently, which Lorraine had accepted as the rhythm of his professional life. He kissed her cheek when he left, and again when he returned, and said the right things at the right moments, and had a quality of being present that she had loved early, and that had thinned over the years into a quality of being nearby, which was not the same thing, and which she had told herself was the ordinary adjustment of a long marriage. They had met at a firm party 11 years ago, when she was still working for another architect, and he was new to his sales region. He had picked up one of her project sketches from the coffee table she had left it on by accident, and studied it for a full minute without asking who had drawn it, which told her he was looking at it rather than performing the looking. Then he had asked if it was hers. She had said yes. He had asked her to explain what he was looking at. She had, in the concise way she explained everything. He had asked a follow-up question that proved he had understood the explanation. That was the thing that had opened the door, not his appearance, not his ease in the room, but the follow-up question. She had not met many men who asked them. In the first years, he had been consistent in the small ways that mattered. He listened when she described a project difficulty. He showed up to her firm's first installation event and stood quietly at the edge of the room without needing to be introduced to everyone. He asked how she was sleeping during the weeks she was up late, finishing drawings. She had loved him with the particular steadiness of someone who had been formed by steady people and who recognized the quality when she found it. The steadiness had thinned. She had told herself, for longer than she should have, that this was the ordinary adjustment of a long marriage. She was done telling herself that now. The first sign had been a phone he now carried angled away from her, in rooms they shared, in the manner of a man who had developed a new habit around something that had not previously required a habit. She had noted it the way she noted an asymmetry in a building elevation, without immediate alarm, with the quiet understanding that asymmetry was never decorative and always meant something underneath it was off. The second sign had been a name she did not recognize, said once in the context of a work story, carrying a familiarity in his voice that did not match the neutral way he framed the reference. The third sign had been a hotel keycard, sitting in the cup holder of the car she shared with him on a weekend when both their vehicles were in the shop. She had picked it up and held it and looked at the property logo for 3 seconds and set it back exactly where it had been. She was watching. She was not yet ready. The warning came from an unexpected direction, which was the way warnings usually came when you were not looking for them. Her closest friend of 20 years, a woman named Odessa, who had been her college roommate and who was now a human resources manager in Norfolk, called her on a Tuesday evening with a tone in her voice that Lorraine had heard only twice before in their shared history, once when Odessa's father had a stroke, and once when she had discovered a contractor defrauding her company's vendor accounts. It was the tone of someone who had been holding a piece of difficult information at arm's length for as long as they responsibly could, and had decided the responsibility had run out. Odessa said she had seen Marcus at a restaurant in Chesapeake 2 weeks prior. She had recognized him immediately. She had seen him with a woman. She had taken a photograph from across the room without deciding to. A reflex, she said, that she could not fully explain to herself. She had spent 14 days turning the photograph over in her mind, deciding whether sending it was her place. She had concluded that not sending it was a choice she would be making on Lorraine's behalf without Lorraine's knowledge, and that this was a choice that did not belong to her. The photograph arrived. Her hands did not shake. She looked at it for a full minute. Then she set the phone face down on the kitchen table and sat with her hands folded and let the full weight of what she was seeing settle into her understanding without reaching for any interpretation of it before she was ready. She was an architect. She understood that the most important thing you could do in the presence of unexpected structural information was to stop and read what the building was actually telling you before you decided what to do about it. You did not tear into a wall because you suspected the wiring was wrong. You ran the diagnostics. You documented what you found. You built the case from the material rather than from the emotion. She picked up the phone again. She looked at the photograph a second time. She identified the restaurant from the signage visible in the background. She identified the table placement. She identified the body language of two people who were not monitoring themselves because they believed they were not being observed. The body language of practiced comfort. She forwarded the photograph to a secure folder on her work device, the same device she used for client confidential materials, protected behind a separate password Kendrick had never asked about. Then, she sent Odessa a single message. "Thank you. I'll handle it from here." She set the phone down and opened her laptop. She was not trained in forensic accounting, but she was trained in reading documents with precision. And she began with the household credit card statements, which she accessed through the shared account portal and pulled for the maximum available window. She read them from the first entry, without assumption, looking for the shape before she tried to name it. Over 14 months, Marcus had charged $38,000 to the shared account at restaurants she had never heard him mention. Hotels in cities adjacent to the cities he had listed as travel destinations. A Chesapeake florist whose delivery address she searched and found was a residential street she did not recognize. And a jewelry purchase in December for $3,200. She had received a book for Christmas. She had been grateful for the book. She wrote every figure in a notebook. She photographed the statements. She built a timeline on a separate document, cross-referencing the charges against his travel calendar, which she still had access to through the household scheduling account. 11 of 14 charged hotel nights aligned with nights he had told her he was in a different city. She opened a new folder on her work device. She named it Structure. She called Patricia Eze the next morning and did not sleep between then and the call. Patricia had been Lorraine's business attorney since the firm's founding and had an office in downtown Virginia Beach that looked, on the inside, exactly like what it was, the workspace of a person who had never once left a loose end unattended. 2 walls held shelved binders organized by client and year. The desk held only what was relevant to the current hour. She read the credit card summary Lorraine had prepared, a single page, charges highlighted, timeline annotated in the margin in Lorraine's precise architect's hand, each entry dated and sourced, without comment until she had read every line. Then she looked up. The household credit card. Both names on the account, both names, and the charges, no corresponding household or disclosed business purpose for any of the flagged items. None. Patricia set the page down with the deliberateness of someone who had made a decision before she set it down. "I'm going to bring in a family law partner for the divorce filings. What I can handle personally is the business side." She paused. You said the firm has been operating for 4 years. Has Marcus had any documented involvement, any role, any contribution, any invested capital, any services rendered? None. The firm is structured as my sole proprietorship. He has no interest in it, no documented role, and has not contributed capital or services at any point. And the current valuation? Lorraine told her the number. Patricia wrote it down. She looked at what she had written. She looked at Lorraine. He has no idea. He has never asked. Patricia picked up her pen, and the meeting moved forward into the architecture of what came next. Tools were meant to work, not shine. The family law partner was a woman named Felicia Stroud, who had practiced in Virginia for 19 years, and who came to her initial meeting with Lorraine having already reviewed the materials Patricia had forwarded, so that the first meeting was less an introduction than a briefing. She had a quality of making complex things navigable without reducing their complexity, which Lorraine appreciated the way she appreciated good structural design, not with enthusiasm, but with the deep satisfaction of encountering something built correctly. Felicia's team spent the following 10 days completing a full documentation package. The credit card analysis, a household funds audit covering the same 14-month period, which identified an additional $6,700 in cash withdrawals from the joint checking account on dates that did not correspond to any household expense. A review of Lorraine's firm corporate structure confirming its status as her sole professional asset, predating the marriage in its founding documents, though formally established in its current form 2 years into it, a distinction Felicia noted with care, and which Patricia's corporate records made incontrovertible. Total documented marital funds redirected without Lorraine's knowledge, $44,700. It was Felicia who told Lorraine about the pregnancy. She had found it through a supplementary background inquiry on Priya Sorrell, standard practice in cases where a third party's circumstances might affect the settlement calculation. The information was not sealed. Priya Sorrell had not been understated about it. Lorraine sat with this information for a quiet moment. Then she asked Felicia to continue. She went home that evening and made dinner and sat across the table from Marcus, and was exactly what she had always been in that chair, composed, attentive, unhurried, and asked about his week, and listened to his answer with the patience of a woman who had already measured everything that mattered, and was simply waiting for the process she had set in motion to arrive at its conclusion. He talked about a sales target he was close to reaching. He said things were going well. She passed him the bread when he reached for it. He was still performing for an audience that had already left. The encounter in the parking lot was not arranged by Lorraine. She had driven to the restaurant in Chesapeake, identified from the December credit card charge as a location Marcus had returned to multiple times, not to confront anyone but to verify a lease address detail Felicia's team had flagged from a public records inquiry, which Lorraine preferred to confirm in person before the filing. She had parked and was walking toward the entrance when Priya Sorrell stepped out of a car 20 feet away and stopped. They regarded each other across the distance of the parking lot. Lorraine had seen the photograph Odessa sent. That had been her only point of reference for this woman's face. It was accurate. Priya Sorrell had the particular composure of a person who had imagined this meeting many times and had decided, in each imagining, that she would be the one controlling it. She looked at Lorraine with an assessment that lasted 2 seconds and concluded, visibly, that the woman standing across from her was exactly what she appeared to be: practical, plainly dressed, carrying nothing remarkable. She announced the pregnancy with the deliberateness of someone placing a card on a table. Lorraine stood still and said nothing. She was an architect. She had stood in front of city planning committees that questioned her competence and contractors who revised her specifications without asking, and clients who brought someone else's drawings to meetings and suggested she might want to reconsider her approach. In none of those rooms had she given them what they were trying to produce. She was not going to give it here, in a parking lot, on an ordinary Thursday afternoon. Priya Sorrell said something else. Something about how Marcus had made his choice, and Lorraine needed to understand what that meant now. She said it with the assurance of someone who had been told a version of events that placed her at the center. Then she laughed. It was a short, sharp sound, designed to land. And then she stepped forward, and her heel caught the raised edge of the parking lot curb behind her, and she went down by her own momentum, her own forward motion, and her own inattention, onto the asphalt, with a sound that removed all performance from the moment. Lorraine had not moved. She had not touched her. She was standing in precisely the place she had been standing for the previous 60 seconds. She looked at the woman on the ground with the neutral, assessing expression she brought to every unexpected structural event. What happened? Is it dangerous? What is the correct next step? She said, in a voice that was the same volume it had been for the entire conversation, that Priya Sorrell should take her time getting up and make sure she was not hurt, and that whatever she intended to do next should be done through an attorney, because Felicia Stroud's office had filed that morning, and all further contact should be directed there. She picked up the folder she had set on the hood of her car when Priya Sorrell had stepped out. She walked to the driver's side. She got in. She drove away without looking back. She was done. 18 months passed like the tide past the house on Renwick Street, steady, indifferent to schedules, entirely on its own terms. Lorraine had not moved from the house. It was in her name, and the mortgage had been in her name since the refinance 3 years prior, a fact that had been unremarkable at the time, and that the settlement confirmed without complication. She had repainted the living room herself in the late winter, a deep sage that caught the morning light at an angle she had not anticipated when she selected the color, and which she came to love for exactly that unexpectedness. She had replaced the back fence boards that had been rotting since the prior year, measuring twice and cutting once the way her grandfather had taught her before she was tall enough to hold the saw properly. She had planted tomatoes along the south wall in spring, in a raised bed she had built from cedar boards, and leveled herself, and by late summer they were splitting their skins with the weight of themselves, which she found every year an unreasonably satisfying thing to witness. The firm had taken on 2 major residential commissions in the preceding 12 months, at a scale she had not previously handled. The combined contract value was $4 million. She had hired a 6th staff member. She was evaluating a second office location in Norfolk. Patricia Ez's corporate structuring was performing the way good architecture performed, carrying its load invisibly, without requiring attention, exactly as designed. There was a man named Calvin, a civil engineer, who had come onto one of her projects as a site consultant and who had impressed her initially by having read the complete specification document before the first meeting, all 42 pages of it, with notes in the margins. He was precise and unhurried, and gave his full attention to whatever was directly in front of him, which was a quality she had learned to identify and to value at its actual weight. She heard about Marcus through a former colleague who had no reason to shade the information. He had entered paternity proceedings that produced financial obligations he had apparently not modeled in his original calculations. His regional sales position had changed following the settlements becoming a matter of professional record in a community that was smaller than people assumed. Priya Sorrell had moved to a different city. The colleague who had been his closest professional ally for a decade had quietly redistributed his time toward other associations. Lorraine noted all of it the way she noted a final inspection report, completely, without omission. And then she closed the file and turned to what was in front of her. On a Sunday morning in September, she stood at the kitchen window with coffee and looked out at the garden and the fence boards she had replaced, and the late tomatoes still holding past the point you would have expected. And the salt air came through the new casings she had fitted herself. And the house was quiet, in the way it became quiet when it belonged to someone who had stopped sharing it with a performance. She had built everything worth keeping. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.